In industrialized countries in the 1800s, many business leaders believed that progress inevitably opened a gap between rich and poor. These leaders cautioned governments to stay out of business and economic affairs. Reformers, however, felt that governments should play a more active role in bettering conditions for the poor. The term laissez-faire refers to the economic policy of letting owners of industry and business set working conditions without interference. That policy favors a free market unregulated by the government. The term comes from a French phrase that means let do, and by extension, let people do as they please. Laissez-faire stemmed from French economic philosophers of the 18th century Enlightenment known as physiocrats. They criticized the idea that nations grow wealthy by placing heavy tariffs on foreign goods. In fact, they argued, government regulations only interfered with the production of wealth. These philosophers believed that if the government allowed free trade, or the flow of commerce in the world market without government regulation, the economy would prosper. During the Industrial Revolution, laissez-faire became linked to modern capitalism. Capitalism is an economic system in which money is invested in business ventures with the goal of making a profit. The ideas of laissez-faire capitalism helped bring about the Industrial Revolution. Adam Smith, a professor at the University of Glasgow in Scotland, defended the idea of a free economy, or free markets, in his 1776 book The Wealth of Nations. According to Smith, progress results when all individuals are allowed to freely follow their own self-interest. Businesses follow their self-interest when they compete with one another for the consumer's money. Each producer tries to provide goods and services that are better and less expensive than those of competitors. Consumers follow their self-interest when they compete with one another to purchase the best goods at the lowest prices. In such a marketplace, Smith thought, a social harmony would result without any government direction or interference. In An Essay on the Principle of Population, written in 1798, English philosopher Thomas Malthus argued that population tended to increase more rapidly than the food supply. Without wars and epidemics to kill off the extra people, most were destined to be poor and miserable. The predictions of Malthus seemed to be coming true in the 1840s. David Ricardo, a wealthy British stockbroker, took Malthus's theory one step further in his book Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, published in 1817. Like Malthus, Ricardo believed that a permanent underclass would always be poor. This was because in a market system, if there are many workers and abundant resources, then labor and resources are cheap. If there are few workers and scarce resources, then they are expensive. Ricardo believed that wages would be forced down as population increased, as it was doing so dramatically in the first half of the 1800s. Thomas Malthus and David Ricardo supported Smith's basic ideas. Like Smith, they believed that natural laws governed economic life. Their important ideas were the foundation of laissez-faire capitalism. Laissez-faire thinkers, such as Smith, Malthus, and Ricardo, opposed government efforts to help poor workers. They thought that creating minimum wage laws and laws that created better working conditions would upset the free market system, lower profits, and undermine the production of wealth in society. Modifying the ideas of Adam Smith, an English philosopher named Jeremy Bentham introduced the philosophy of utilitarianism. Bentham wrote his most influential works in the late 1700s. He argued that people should judge ideas, institutions, and actions on the basis of their utility or usefulness. He argued that the government should try to promote the greatest good for the greatest number of people. A government policy was only useful if it promoted this goal. Utilitarians, like Bentham, also pushed for reforms in the legal and prison systems and in education. Bentham argued, however, that in general the individual should be free to pursue his or her own advantage without interference from the state. John Stuart Mill, a British philosopher and economist, led the utilitarian movement in the 1800s. Mill came to question unregulated capitalism. He believed it was wrong that workers should lead deprived lives that sometimes bordered on starvation. Mill wished to help ordinary working people with policies that would lead to a more equal division of profits. He also favored a cooperative system of agriculture and women's rights, including the right to vote. Mill called for the government to do away with great differences in wealth. Other reformers took an even more active approach. They supported an idea called utopianism, which called for the creation of ideal communities based on equality and sharing of wealth. Shocked by the misery and poverty of the working class, a British factory owner named Robert Owen improved working conditions for his employees. Near his cotton mill in New Lanark, Scotland, Owen built houses, which he rented at low rates. He prohibited children under 10 from working in the mills and provided free schooling. In 1824, he traveled to the United States and founded a cooperative community in New Harmony, Indiana in 1825. He intended this community to be a utopia, but New Harmony only lasted 3 years. Nevertheless, it inspired the founding of other such communities. By the mid-1800s, some reformers were calling for a new economic philosophy to offset the effects of industrialization. They advocated an idea called socialism. In socialism, the factors of production are owned by the public and operate for the welfare of all. Socialism grew out of an optimistic view of human nature, a belief in progress, and a concern for social justice. Socialists argued that the government should actively plan the economy rather than depending on free market capitalism to do the job. They argued that government control of factories, mines, railroads, and other key industries would abolish poverty and promote equality. Public ownership, they believed, would help the workers, who were at the mercy of greedy employers. Two early and influential socialist thinkers were the French reformers Charles Fourier and Henri de Saint-Simon. The writings of a German journalist named Karl Marx introduced the world to a radical type of socialism called Marxism. Marx and Friedrich Engels, a German whose father owned a textile mill in Manchester, outlined their ideas in a 23-page pamphlet called The Communist Manifesto, which was first published in 1848. In their manifesto, Marx and Engels argued that human societies have always been divided into warring classes. In their own time, these were the middle-class haves, or employers, called the bourgeoisie, and the have-nots, or workers, called the proletariat. While the wealthy controlled the means of producing goods, the poor performed back-breaking labor under terrible conditions. This situation resulted in conflict. As Marx and Engels stated in their manifesto, freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on in an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. According to Marx and Engels, the Industrial Revolution had enriched the wealthy and impoverished the poor. The two writers predicted that the workers would eventually overthrow the owners. In the manifesto, Marx and Engels made their rallying cry. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries, unite! Marx believed that the capitalist system, which produced the Industrial Revolution, would eventually destroy itself in the following way. First, factories would drive small artisans out of business, leaving only a small number of manufacturers to control all the wealth. These manufacturers would brutally exploit the proletariat. Eventually, the proletariat would become so large and their conditions so poor that they would revolt. The workers would seize control of the factories and mills from the capitalists and produce what society needed. Workers, sharing in the profits, would bring about economic equality for all people. The workers would control the government in what Marx called a dictatorship of the proletariat. After a period of cooperative living and education, the state or government would wither away as a classless society developed. Marx called this final phase pure communism. Marx described communism as a form of complete socialism in which all of the means of production, all the land, mines, factories, railroads, and businesses, would be owned by the people. Private property would in effect cease to exist. All goods and services would be shared equally. For all its revolutionary fire, the Communist Manifesto produced few short-term results. The manifesto did play some role in inspiring some of the widespread revolts that shook Europe during 1848 and 1849, but Europe's conservative leaders eventually put down these uprisings. Although Marx thought his ideas would have their greatest appeal in Western industrialized nations, it was actually in non-Western and mainly agricultural societies that communism first took root. In the 1900s, revolutions in Russia, China, Vietnam, and Cuba all produced communist governments. In all these places, revolutionary leaders adapted Marx's beliefs and arguments to their own specific situations and needs. In their pamphlet, Marx and Engels condemned the inequalities of early industrial economies, yet several of Marx's and Engels' predictions have since proved wrong. They believed that economic forces alone dominated society. Time has shown, however, that religion, nationalism, ethnic loyalties, and a desire for democratic reforms may be as strong influences on history as economic forces. In addition, the gap between the rich and poor within the industrialized countries failed to widen in the way that Marx and Engels predicted, mostly because of the adoption of political and economic reforms. One of the most important reforms that took place in industrialized nations was the formation of unions, or voluntary associations of workers. As we have seen, during the Industrial Revolution, factory workers faced long hours, dirty and dangerous working conditions, and the threat of being laid off. By the 1800s, working people became more active in politics. To press for reforms, workers joined together in unions. A union spoke for all the workers in a particular trade. Unions engaged in collective bargaining, or negotiations between workers and their employers. They bargained for better working conditions and higher pay. If factory owners refused these demands, union members could strike or refuse to work. Skilled workers led the way in forming unions because their special skills gave them extra bargaining power. Management would have trouble replacing such skilled workers as carpenters, printers, and spinners. Thus, the earliest unions helped the lower middle class more than they helped the poorest workers. Eventually, however, unions extended their activity to all workers, both skilled and unskilled. The union movement underwent slow, painful growth in Great Britain. British unions had shared goals of raising wages and improving working conditions. For years, the British government denied workers the right to form unions. The government saw unions as a threat to social order and stability. Indeed, the Combination Acts of 1799 and 1800 outlawed unions and strikes. Bravely ignoring the threat of jail or job loss, factory workers joined unions anyway. Parliament finally repealed the Combination Acts in 1824. After 1825, the British government unhappily tolerated unions. By 1875, British trade unions had won the right to strike and picket peacefully. They had also built up a membership of about 1 million people. In the United States, skilled workers had belonged to unions since the early 1800s. In 1886, several unions joined together to form the organization that would become the American Federation of Labor, or AFL. A series of successful strikes won AFL members higher wages and shorter hours. In both Great Britain and the United States, new laws reformed some of the worst abuses of industrialization. In 1832, for example, Parliament set up the Sadler Committee to investigate child labor. As a result of this committee's findings, Parliament passed the Factory Act of 1833. The new law made it illegal to hire children under 9 years old. Children from ages 9 to 12 could not work more than 8 hours a day. Young people from 13 to 17 could not work more than 12 hours. In 1842, the Mines Act prevented women and children from working underground. In 1847, the Parliament passed a bill that helped working women as well as their children. The 10 Hours Act of 1847 limited the workday to 10 hours for women and children who worked in factories. Reformers in the United States also passed legislation to protect child workers. In 1904, a group of progressive reformers organized the National Child Labor Committee to end child labor. Arguing that child labor lowered wages for all workers, labor union members joined the reformers. Together, these groups pressured national and state politicians to ban child labor and set maximum working hours. The Supreme Court in 1919 had objected to a federal child labor law. However, it did allow individual states to legally limit the working hours of women and later of men. Almost from the beginning, reform movements sprang up in response to the negative impact of industrialization. These reforms included improving the workplace and extending the right to vote to working class men. The same impulse toward reform, along with the ideals of the French Revolution, also helped to end slavery and promote new rights for women and children. William Wilberforce, a highly religious man, was a member of Parliament who led the fight for abolition, the end of the slave trade and slavery in the British Empire. Parliament passed a bill to end the slave trade in the British West Indies in 1807. After he retired from Parliament in 1825, Wilberforce continued his fight to free the slaves. Britain finally abolished slavery in its empire in 1833. British anti-slavery activists had mixed motives. Some were morally against slavery, such as the abolitionist William Wilberforce. Others viewed slave labor as an economic threat. Furthermore, a new class of industrialists developed who supported cheap labor rather than slave labor. They soon gained power in Parliament. In the United States, the movement to fulfill the promise of the Declaration of Independence by ending slavery grew in the early 1800s. The enslavement of African people finally ended in the United States when the Union won the Civil War in 1865. With the end of the U.S. Civil War, enslavement persisted in the Americas only in Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Brazil. In Puerto Rico, slavery was ended in 1873. Spain finally abolished slavery in its Cuban colony in 1886. Not until 1888 did Brazil's huge enslaved population win freedom. The Industrial Revolution proved a mixed blessing for women. On the one hand, factory work offered higher wages than work done at home. Women spinners in Manchester, for example, earned much more money than women who stayed home to spin cotton thread. Factory work also gave women a new sense of freedom and independence from the strict world of family and village life. On the other hand, women factory workers usually made only one-third as much money as men. Also, some women factory workers faced the dangers of physical and even sexual abuse from male overseers. Women led reform movements to address this and other pressing social issues. During the mid-1800s, for example, women formed unions in the trades where they dominated. In Britain, some women served as safety inspectors in factories where other women worked. In the United States, college-educated women like Jane Addams ran settlement houses. These community centers served the poor residents of slum neighborhoods. Addams established Hull House in Chicago, which served poor and working-class women. In both the United States and Britain, women who had rallied for the abolition of slavery began to wonder why their own rights should be denied on the basis of gender. The movement for women's rights began in the United States as early as 1848. Women activists around the world joined to found International Council for Women in 1888. Delegates and observers from 27 countries attended the Council's 1899 meeting. Public education was another major area of concern for reformers in industrialized nations. One of the most prominent U.S. reformers, Horace Mann of Massachusetts, favored free public education for all children. Mann, who spent his own childhood working at hard labor, warned, "If we do not prepare children to become good citizens, if we do not enrich their minds with knowledge, then our republic must go down to destruction." By the 1850s, many states were starting to establish a system of public schools. In Western Europe, free public schooling became available in the late 1800s.